Hey Reddit, my name is Alex, and I'm a 17-year-old high school student. This is a story I never thought I'd share, but here I am, hoping to get some clarity or maybe just a virtual shoulder to cry on. It's about my mom, her new husband, and the way I was slowly erased from my own family. A bit of backstory: my parents never married. I was born after a brief fling they had in college. Despite their differences, they both decided they wanted to be a part of my life, so I grew up splitting my time equally between them. I'd spend 1 month at my mom's place, then the next at my dad's. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it worked. Both my parents made sacrifices to stay in the same city for me. My dad turned down job opportunities that would have taken him across the country, and my mom gave up on potential relationships to focus on raising me, or so she said. 2 years ago, everything changed when my mom met Eddie. He was charming, attentive, and made her laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. At first, I was happy for her. She deserved someone who made her feel special. But my excitement faded as I realized Eddie didn't seem to want me around. At the beginning, Eddie was polite. He'd ask me about school and my hobbies. I did my best to be respectful and engaging, hoping we could build a decent relationship. But after a few visits, he started to pull back. He stopped asking questions. He stopped saying hello. Eventually, he stopped acknowledging me altogether. It was bizarre. One day we were chatting about soccer. The next, he was acting like I didn't exist. I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. I asked my mom if I'd upset him somehow, but she just brushed it off. "That's just how Eddie is," she said. "He's a quiet guy. He needs time to adjust." Adjust to what? I wasn't a new addition to the family. I'd been there for 17 years, but I tried to be understanding. I told myself that maybe he needed more time. Maybe he'd warm up eventually. He didn't. After a year of dating, Eddie proposed. My mom said yes, and they got married a few months later. Eddie and his 2 sons, Ryan, who's 16, and Noah, who's 13, moved into our house. I had met them a few times before, but they never really talked to me. I figured that would change once we were all living together. I was wrong. Eddie's sons followed his lead. They barely acknowledged me, and when they did, it was with cold, disinterested glances. The house that once felt like home turned into a place where I was invisible. My mom was the only person who spoke to me, and even then, it was mostly about keeping the peace. "Just give it time," she'd say. "They're still adjusting." Adjusting to what? Ignoring me? I didn't understand it, but I bit my tongue because I didn't want to hurt her. I knew how much she'd sacrificed for me, and I didn't want to be the reason her new marriage failed. But the truth was, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I dreaded going back to my mom's house every month, because I knew I'd spend the next 4 weeks being treated like I didn't exist. It was exhausting and demoralizing. I tried talking to my mom about it, but she always shut me down. "Alex, I've done everything for you," she'd say, her voice laced with guilt. "The least you can do is make this work for me." So, I tried. I put up with it for 3 years. I endured the silence, the cold shoulders, the awkward dinners where I was the only one left out of conversations. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could handle it, but deep down, it hurt. Then, last month, things finally reached a breaking point. It was supposed to be my month at my mom's house. I was already feeling down because I'd fallen out with some friends at school. I wasn't in the best headspace, but I figured I'd power through. I woke up one morning to an empty house. The night before, everything had seemed normal. Well, as normal as it could be in that house. But when I walked downstairs, there was no sign of my mom, Eddie, or his kids. At first, I thought maybe they'd gone out for breakfast, but as the hours passed, it became clear they weren't coming back anytime soon. I called my mom, and thankfully, she answered. "Hey, where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, we went on a little trip," she said casually. "We'll be back in a week." I was stunned. They'd gone on a family vacation and left me behind without even telling me? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And you didn't think to let me know?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she replied. "You're on summer break. You don't have school. I thought you could watch the house." Watch the house. I wasn't a security guard. I was her son. The hurt and anger bubbled to the surface. "I'm not staying here by myself," I said firmly. "I'm going to Dad's." "Oh, come on, Alex," she sighed. "Don't be dramatic." But I wasn't being dramatic. I was done. Done being treated like an afterthought. Done being invisible. Done sacrificing my own happiness for hers. I packed a bag, locked up the house, and left. I put the keys under the potted plant by the front door, the same spot my mom always used, and drove to my dad's place. When I showed up, Dad was surprised to see me. I was supposed to stay with my mom for another week. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, concern etched on his face. I broke down. All the emotions I'd been bottling up for years came pouring out. I told him everything, about Eddie, about his kids, about how I'd been treated like a ghost in my own home, and finally, about how my mom had left me behind to go on vacation with her new family. By the time I finished, I was in tears. I hadn't realized just how much it had been weighing on me until I said it all out loud. Dad was furious. Not at me, but at my mom. "This isn't right," he said, shaking his head. "You deserve better than this." Hearing those words from him made me feel seen for the first time in years, but I knew things were far from over. The fallout was just beginning. After that day, everything changed. The moment I walked into my dad's house, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to please people who wouldn't even acknowledge my existence. My dad welcomed me with open arms, and I felt a sense of relief I hadn't realized I needed. But the fallout from my decision to leave my mom's house came faster than I expected. 5 days went by without a single word from her. I thought maybe she'd reach out to check on me or apologize for leaving me alone, but there was nothing. Not a call, not a text. It hurt more than I cared to admit. I'd always known that Eddie and his kids didn't want me around, but to see my mom go along with it, to be okay with leaving me behind, was a wound that ran deep. Then, finally, my phone rang. It was my mom. I hesitated before answering, not sure if I was ready to face whatever she had to say. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "What the hell, Alex?" she yelled, her voice filled with anger. "You left the house completely unguarded. We've been robbed." I was stunned. "Wait, what? Robbed?" "Yes. The TV is gone, the jewelry box is gone, and even Eddie's expensive sound system is gone." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "I tried calling you, Mom. I left the keys where you always do, under the potted plant. I told you I wasn't staying in the house alone." "That's no excuse," she snapped. "You should have stayed. You knew we were counting on you." I felt my blood boil. Counting on me? "You didn't even tell me you were leaving. You left me behind like I didn't matter. And now you're blaming me for something that isn't my fault?" "You're being dramatic," she replied coldly. "This was about trust, Alex. You broke that trust." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No, Mom. You broke my trust. You and Eddie have been treating me like a ghost for years. You left without telling me, and now you're blaming me for a robbery? That's not fair." She didn't respond right away. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "We'll talk about this when we get home," she said finally, her voice quieter, but still cold. "No, we won't," I replied firmly. "I'm staying with Dad. I'm done being treated like an outsider in my own family." With that, I hung up. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding, but I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time, I'd stood up for myself. Later that night, I sat down with my dad to explain everything that had happened. He listened patiently, his expression growing darker with every word I said. "This has been going on for years?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. I nodded. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to cause any trouble. I thought I could handle it." "Alex, you shouldn't have to handle that kind of treatment," he said firmly. "You're my son. You deserve to feel safe and valued, no matter whose house you're in." Hearing those words brought tears to my eyes. I'd been carrying this burden for so long, and I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to tell me it wasn't my fault. "I'm going to talk to your mom," Dad said. "This has gone too far." I shook my head. "Don't. She won't listen. She's too wrapped up in Eddie and his kids to care about what I'm feeling." But my dad wasn't having it. "She needs to hear it, Alex. Whether she listens or not, that's on her. But I won't let her treat you like this anymore." A few days later, my mom called again. This time, her tone was different. Less angry, more desperate. "Alex, we need to talk," she said. "Eddie is really upset about the robbery. He thinks you should apologize." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Apologize? For what? For not wanting to stay alone in a house that doesn't feel like home anymore? "Alex, please. He thinks you should take responsibility." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Eddie hasn't spoken to me in years, and now the first thing he has to say is that I should apologize? "Are you serious?" "He's just upset," she said weakly. "We all are." "Well, I'm upset too, Mom. I've been upset for years, but you never seem to care about that." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her trying to come up with a response, but nothing came. "I'm not apologizing," I said firmly. "I'm done bending over backward to make everyone else comfortable while I'm treated like I don't matter. Alex, please, can't we just move past this?" She pleaded. "No, Mom, not this time." I hung up again, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. I loved my mom, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own mental health for her happiness. That night, my dad sat me down again. "I've been thinking," he said. "I'm going to file for full custody." I stared at him, shocked. "What? You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," he replied. "You deserve to live in a home where you feel loved and valued. If your mom can't provide that, then it's my job to make sure you're safe." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Thank you, Dad," he nodded. "You're my son, Alex. I'll always fight for you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. My dad started the legal process to gain full custody, and I focused on getting back to a sense of normalcy. I reconnected with some friends, spent more time on my schoolwork, and tried to remind myself that I wasn't the problem. But the fallout wasn't over yet. My mom wasn't giving up easily. One night, I got a message from Eddie. It was the first time he'd ever reached out to me directly. "We need to talk," the message read. I stared at it, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, curiosity maybe, wanted to hear what he had to say. Against my better judgment, I replied, "When?" His response came quickly. "Tomorrow. Come to the diner on 5th at noon." I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. Not anymore. The next day, I found myself sitting in my car outside the diner Eddie had chosen. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I wasn't sure what I was more anxious about, what Eddie would say, or how I'd react to it. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let him walk all over me like he had for the past few years. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked into the diner. It was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered around. Eddie was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee in front of him. He looked up when I approached, his expression unreadable. "Alex," he said with a nod. "Eddie," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. The tension between us was thick, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I appreciate you coming," he finally said, breaking the silence. I raised an eyebrow. "You made it sound urgent." He took a sip of his coffee, avoiding eye contact. "It is. Your mom is devastated. She hasn't been herself since you left." I crossed my arms, leaning back in the booth. "Is that why we're here? So you can guilt-trip me into going back?" Eddie sighed, rubbing his temples. "No, that's not why I asked you to meet me. I wanted to clear the air. There are things you need to know." "Like what?" I asked, my tone skeptical. He set his coffee down and folded his hands on the table. "When your mom and I first started dating, she told me things about you, things that made me wary." I frowned. "What kind of things?" "She said you had a history of acting out, that you didn't handle change well. She told me you'd driven away some of her previous boyfriends." I stared at him, stunned. "That's not true. I know that now," Eddie said quietly. "But back then, I believed her. I thought I was protecting my kids by keeping my distance. I didn't want to put them in a situation where they'd feel uncomfortable." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "You ignored me for years because of lies my mom told you?" Eddie nodded, his expression regretful. "I realize now that I was wrong. I should have given you a chance, gotten to know you for who you are, not who I was told you were." I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Do you have any idea how that made me feel? To be treated like I didn't matter? Like I wasn't part of the family?" "I can't change the past, Alex," Eddie said, his voice somber. "But I want to make things right. I want to apologize." I stared at him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. There was a part of me that wanted to accept his apology, to let go of the anger and hurt I'd been carrying. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of silence and neglect, wasn't ready to forgive so easily. "What about your kids?" I asked. "They've treated me the same way you have. Are you going to apologize for them too?" Eddie looked down at his hands. "They were following my lead. I've already spoken to them. They know they were wrong." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "Why now? Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not," Eddie admitted. "And because I see how much it's hurting your mom. She loves you, Alex. She just doesn't know how to show it sometimes." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's one hell of an understatement." Eddie looked at me, his expression serious. "She's made mistakes. We both have. But she's your mom. Don't shut her out completely. I shook my head. I'm not the one who shut her out. She did that when she chose to put you and your kids above me. I understand why you feel that way, Eddie said softly. But families are complicated. It's never as black and white as it seems. I sat in silence for a moment, staring out the window. The weight of the past few years pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I'll think about it, I said finally. But I'm not making any promises. Eddie nodded, accepting my answer. That's all I'm asking. As I stood to leave, he reached out and placed a hand on my arm. Alex, I'm sorry, truly. I looked down at his hand, then back up at him. I'll need more than words, Eddie. Actions speak louder. With that, I walked out of the diner, my mind racing. I'd gotten the apology I never thought I'd hear, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined. The scars Eddie and my mom had left on me weren't going to heal overnight. When I got home, my dad was waiting for me in the living room. How did it go? He asked, concern etched on his face. I shrugged. He apologized. Dad raised an eyebrow. And I don't know how to feel about it, I admitted. I've spent so long being angry, and now I'm just tired. Dad nodded, understanding. Take your time, Alex. You don't have to forgive anyone right away. You've been through a lot. Just focus on what makes you happy. I smiled weakly. Thanks, Dad. As I headed upstairs to my room, I thought about what Eddie had said. Families are complicated, he'd told me. But was that enough of an excuse for the way I'd been treated? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I was done being invisible. From now on, I was going to make sure my voice was heard. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about my conversation with Eddie. His apology lingered in my mind, stirring up emotions I'd tried to bury. Part of me wanted to believe he was sincere, that he genuinely wanted to make things right. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of silence and exclusion, remained guarded. I tried to distract myself by focusing on school and spending time with my dad. He could tell something was weighing on me, but he didn't push. He'd always been like that, patient, waiting until I was ready to talk. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, he finally spoke up. You've been quiet lately, he said, his voice gentle. Is everything okay? I sighed, setting down my fork. It's just a lot to process. Eddie's apology? Yeah. I rubbed my temples, feeling the tension building. I don't know what to think. He says he wants to make things right, but how do I trust someone who's ignored me for years? Dad nodded thoughtfully. Trust is earned, not given. It's okay to take your time. I just keep wondering why Mom did it, I confessed. Why did she tell him all those lies about me? Was it easier for her to blame me than to be honest with him? That's something only she can answer, Dad said. But you deserve answers, Alex. You've been through enough. A few days later, I got a message from my mom. Can we talk? It read. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her feel the same silence I'd endured. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, despite everything, wanted closure. Okay, I replied. Tomorrow at noon. Same diner. The next day, I arrived early. I sat at the same booth where I'd met Eddie, my heart pounding as I waited. When my mom walked in, she looked different, tired, worn down. Gone was the polished, confident woman I'd always known. She looked lost. Alex, she greeted, her voice tentative. Mom, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She sat across from me, fidgeting with her hands. Thank you for meeting me. I'm here for answers, I said bluntly. No more excuses. She winced at my tone, but nodded. You're right. You deserve the truth. For a moment, she sat in silence, gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak. When Eddie and I started dating, I was scared, she admitted. I'd been alone for so long, and I wanted this to work, but I was afraid that if he knew the truth, that I wasn't ready to take in his mom or his kids, he'd leave. So you blamed me, I said, my voice flat. She looked down at her hands. Yes? I thought it would be easier to say it was you, that you didn't want them around. I never imagined it would go this far. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. You let him think I was the problem for years, Mom. You let me suffer in silence while he and his kids treated me like I didn't exist. I know, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to forgive her, but the pain was still too raw. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. It's going to take time. I can't just forget everything that's happened. I understand, she said, wiping her tears. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. As we sat there, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't about letting go of the pain overnight. It was a process, a journey, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said honestly, but I'm willing to see if things can change. She nodded, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. Thank you, Alex. That's all I can ask. As I left the diner, I felt a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, hope. The road to healing would be long, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own story. The days that followed my conversation with my mom were anything but peaceful. I wanted to believe that things could change, that she genuinely wanted to mend our broken relationship. But trust isn't built on words alone, and I wasn't sure I could handle more disappointment. One evening, as I was finishing up my homework, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mom. I know I've hurt you, but Eddie and I need to talk to you together. Can we meet soon? I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. What more could they possibly have to say? Part of me wanted to ignore the message, but curiosity got the better of me. Fine. When and where? I replied. We agreed to meet at a park near my dad's house the following afternoon. It felt strange meeting them in a public space, but I guess it made sense. Neutral ground. When I arrived, Eddie and my mom were already there, sitting on a bench. They looked tense. I took a deep breath and walked over, standing a few feet away. Alex, my mom started, her voice shaky. Thank you for coming. I'm here. What's this about? I asked, crossing my arms. Eddie cleared his throat. We wanted to tell you that. We're separating. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. What? It's been coming for a while, Eddie continued. After everything that's happened, we realized we've been holding on to something that wasn't working. I blinked, struggling to process the news. And what does this have to do with me? My mom looked down at her hands. A lot of it has to do with you, and the lies I told. Eddie nodded. When I found out the truth, when I realized you weren't the problem, I couldn't look at your mom the same way. I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and anger. So you're divorcing because of me? No, Eddie said quickly. We're divorcing because of the lies and the lack of trust. You were just caught in the middle of it. I sat down on the bench across from them, my mind racing. So what now? My mom wiped a tear from her cheek. I want to focus on rebuilding our relationship, Alex. I know I failed you. I want to make it right. I scoffed. It's not that simple. You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to be okay. I know, she whispered, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Eddie stood up, shoving his hands into his pockets. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for how I treated you. I let my own insecurities cloud my judgment. I looked up at him, searching for any hint of manipulation, but all I saw was regret. You should have talked to me. You should have gotten to know me instead of believing lies. You're right, he admitted. I can't undo the past, but I'm hoping you can move forward without carrying the weight of my mistakes. I didn't respond right away. The air felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Eddie turned to my mom. I'll give you two some space. As he walked away, my mom shifted closer to me. Alex, I'm so sorry for everything. I know I've lost your trust, and I don't expect to earn it back overnight, but I'm willing to try. Please, just give me a chance. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I don't know if I can. You let me suffer for years, Mom. How do I just forget that? You don't have to forget, she said softly, but maybe we can start over, build something new. I stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I need time. I'll be here when you're ready, she promised. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. My mom was finally taking responsibility, and Eddie was out of the picture. But the damage was done, and healing wouldn't come easy. When I got home, my dad was waiting for me in the living room. How did it go? He asked. They're divorcing, I said bluntly. Dad raised an eyebrow. Really? Yeah, and Mom wants to fix things with me. He nodded slowly. And what do you want? I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair. I don't know. I guess I want to move on. I'm tired of carrying all this anger. That's a good start, Dad said with a smile. But take your time, Alex. Healing isn't a race. I nodded, grateful for his support. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The following weeks were surprisingly quiet. My mom kept her distance, giving me the time and space I needed to process everything. Eddie had moved out, and their divorce was moving forward. For the first time in years, it felt like things were settling into a new normal. But normal didn't mean easy. I still carried the weight of everything that had happened, the years of being invisible, the lies my mom told, and the deep-seated anger I'd held onto for so long. Letting go of that anger wasn't simple, but I knew I couldn't carry it forever. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the park. The air was crisp, and the leaves were turning shades of red and orange. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the emotional storm I'd been through. As I walked, I thought about everything: my childhood, my parents' sacrifices, and the complicated relationships that had shaped me. I pulled out my phone and texted my mom. "Let's talk." She responded almost immediately. "When?" "Now." "The park." A little while later, she arrived, looking nervous, but hopeful. We sat on a bench, the silence between us heavy, but not unbearable. "I didn't expect to hear from you," she said quietly. "I've been thinking," I began, staring at the ground. "About everything. About us." She nodded, waiting for me to continue. "I've been angry for so long, Mom. Angry at you, at Eddie, at the way things turned out. But I'm tired of being angry." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alex. I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now how wrong I was." I took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can fully forgive you yet, but I'm willing to try. For both of us." Her tears spilt over, and she reached for my hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." We sat in silence for a while, watching the leaves fall from the trees. It felt symbolic, like we were shedding the past and making room for something new. "I need to ask you something," I said, breaking the silence. "Why did you lie to Eddie about me? Why make me out to be the problem?" She wiped her tears and looked at me with a pained expression. "Because I was scared. Scared that he wouldn't accept me if he knew the truth, that I wasn't ready to take on his family. So I made you an excuse. It was cowardly, and I hate myself for it." I nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer I wanted to hear, but it was the truth, and that mattered. "I'm not going to let you back into my life without boundaries," I said firmly. "We need to rebuild trust, and that's going to take time." "I understand," she said softly. "I'll do whatever it takes." As we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The wounds were still there, but they didn't feel as raw. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, my own story. Back home, I sat with my dad at the kitchen table. He was reading the newspaper, but he looked up when I walked in. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "We talked. Really talk." He smiled, folding the paper. "That's a big step." "Yeah," I said, sitting across from him. "I told her things need to change. I'm not going to let her back in without boundaries." "That's smart," Dad said. "Protect yourself, but leave room for healing. You've got a good head on your shoulders." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "It's what parents are supposed to do." His words hit me hard. For so long, I'd felt like I had to earn love and acceptance. But sitting there with my dad, I realized that love isn't something you earn. It's given freely by the people who truly care about you. Over the next few months, life continued to shift. My mom and I started meeting regularly, small steps toward rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but there was also progress. Eddie reached out once more, sending me a heartfelt email apologizing again for his behavior. I read it, but I didn't feel the need to respond. Some bridges are best left burnt. As for me, I focused on my future. I poured my energy into school, my friends, and my own happiness. The anger that had once consumed me slowly faded, replaced by a sense of peace. One day, as I sat in my room, reflecting on everything, I realized something important. I wasn't defined by the way others had treated me. I wasn't the invisible kid, the afterthought, or the scapegoat. I was Alex, strong, resilient, and worthy of love and respect. And that realization changed everything. Life isn't about holding on to the pain of the past. It's about choosing your own path, setting your own boundaries, and surrounding yourself with people who uplift you. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. This is my story, and I'm proud of how far I've come.